Hello, and welcome to Saturday Morning with Dr. Childress. Uh, it's Saturday morning coffee. I'm not sure if this is posting out to the internet or if this is just posting privately to me. So we'll see about that. Uh, I'm trying a new software program and we'll see what happens. So today I want to talk about the associated clinical signs and a um, research project research article that Melanie Greenham, myself, and Dorsey Pruder have just written. It's up on ResearchGate, and we'll be submitting it for publication regarding the 12 associated clinical signs as evidenced in 46 families in high conflict divorce. Um, the data is through Dorsey Pruder's custody resolution method. Um, and so, my goodness gracious, um, there's so much to talk about with this. Let me start by just talking about Dorsey Pruder and the custody resolution method. That is a brilliant piece of work that she accomplished. Dorsey Pruder is a businesswoman and family coach. She's not a university researcher and she's not a psychologist. But the issue that she faced was that the mental health professionals were not identifying the pathology, were not making the diagnosis, and were not applying any established knowledge in their decisions and judgments about what was happening. So she needed a way to document for the court the symptoms that were involved in the family that would lead to the appropriate diagnosis of child psychological abuse and the need for protective separation. And so, what she did is she developed a research project for families. It's called a content analysis, where you take all the data that's surrounding these families and you tag it or code it. So it's data coding is the specific process where you hire people to go in, read all the raw data, and code whenever certain categories show up in the data. And that's a standard research methodology, content analysis of large data sets using data coding. So she did that. She worked with some computer people, the computer technology people, to come up with the software that allows people, data taggers, to identify the symptoms of concern in the surrounding data, emails, texts, um, court records, declarations to the court, mental health reports, all the documented data that surrounds these families in high conflict divorce. She hires people, goes through it, reads it, categorizes it, and puts it into this computer file so that you wind up with frequency counts for the various categories of interest. In this case, what I'll be talking about today is the 12 associated clinical signs. And so there's frequencies of how often they occur in the data surrounding the family. And um, and then you can actually look if on a frequency count, let's say there's seven um, of ACS, 3, the exclusion demand, 7 incidents of that in the data. You can actually go back and click a little link and it will show you each of the 7 incidents, why that was tagged as that incident. And so she's got a whole software program that supports it that she developed. And then she hires the data taggers, the people to go out and review individual records and tag all the data for the family into the various categories. So she constructed a research project to identify the symptoms in the family because the mental health professionals were refusing to identify the symptoms. They were just refusing. They're saying, no, I'm not going to tell you if these symptoms are present. So she had to come up with an entire data analysis surrounding the data because the mental health people are refusing to diagnose and identify the pathology in the family courts. And that's just brilliant work. Now, as she's doing this, I was kind of aware of what she was doing. And she doesn't know that I don't think she knew that this was a actual research methodology, um, content analysis, data coding, and that she was doing an excellent job of working it up. I saw it, and so I began to consult with her because she's tagging for the 3 diagnostic indicators and the 12 associated clinical signs that I recommend be identified. If the 3 diagnostic indicators are present, there is no other explanation for those 3 symptoms other than a shared persecutory delusion and false attachment pathology created by a narcissistic borderline dark personality parent. That's the only um, explanation for that set of 3 diagnostic indicators. And what those are, I put them up on a diagnostic checklist for pathogenic parenting. You can go up and download it off my website. The 3 diagnostic indicators are attachment suppression towards a normal range parent. That's an impossible symptom. Okay, the prevalence of that symptom in the general population is 0. Children never, ever, ever reject a normal range parent. Problematic parents produce an insecure attachment. Normal range parent, you never see attachment problems because the attachment system is a goal corrected primary motivational system of the brain, always maintains the set goal of establishing an attachment bond. So if that's a normal range parent, we should see a normal range attachment bonding motivation. Diagnostic indicator 1 is that a child is rejecting a normal range parent. That's not possible. But what that does, that symptom, is it puts us in the domain of attachment pathology. We're not dealing with ADHD or autism or depression or anxiety. We're dealing with attachment pathology. And with the attachment system, a child rejecting a parent, it's going to be caused by the parenting. The attachment system never spontaneously dysfunctions. It only becomes dysfunctional in response to problematic parenting. And at that level of severity, a child rejecting a parent, that is child abuse range. So the first rule out diagnosis becomes possible child abuse by the targeted parent for that severity, a child rejecting a parent. The alternative diagnosis, if there's no child abuse by the normal range parent, which it's normal range parent, there's no child abuse, then it's shared persecutory delusion and child psychological abuse by the allied parent, producing a false attachment pathology in the child for secondary gain of manipulating the court and meeting their own needs. So we have a shared persecutory delusion and factitious disorder imposed on another, or child abuse by the targeted parent. Those are your differential diagnoses, and those will arise from diagnostic indicator 1. We have attachment system suppression towards a normal range parent. Prevalence of that is 0. How do we define normal range parent? Well, that's the parenting practices rating scale. So that's another rating scale up on my website. You can download it. Defines the parenting into 4 levels: abusive range, just under abusive range, normal range problematic, and normal range healthy. So levels 1 and 2 are attachment or abusive range. Levels 3 and 4 are normal range. And so the mental health professional just does a clinical interviews, talks to people. How do you discipline? How are you do, and decides on where that parenting practices of the targeted parent are located. That brings all the fighting around that issue to a close. We have clear documentation from the mental health people what their assessment of the parenting practices of the targeted parent are. Are they normal range or are they abusive range? So we can put that aside. Then we go to diagnostic indicator 1. Is a child rejecting a normal range parent? Yes. Boom. That moves to diagnostic indicator 2, which is high protest behavior, extremely high. So we either get high anger or high anxiety. How do we define that? High anger or high anxiety? For the purposes of the diagnostic assessment, We define those, I've defined those as 5 narcissistic personality traits displayed by the child. That's the high anger variant, grandiosity, absence of empathy, entitlement, haughty and arrogant attitude, and splitting. So I'm even identifying specifically what those narcissistic traits are going to show up. These 5. In addition, there could and or be high anxious presentation. And for that variant, the operational definition is a DSM-5 diagnosis of a specific phobia. But the specific phobia is a mother phobia or a father phobia. The child has a phobia towards a parent. That, again, is prevalence of 0. That's never happened ever. It will never happen because the attachment networks of the child will not allow that to happen. It is impossible for a child to develop a phobia about a parent. There's predators who are going to eat the child. The child, starves from, lack of care. That the genes for rejecting parents are removed from the gene pool. So it's going to be one of those 2 symptom features. And if you got a phobia towards a parent, you have to explain why. How did that arise? A specific phobia towards a parent. Or how did a child acquire 5 specific narcissistic symptoms towards a parent, including splitting and the absence of empathy? The absence of empathy is a capacity for cruelty. So that's how you assess that with the child. What they're doing cruel? And then how do they respond to that? We'll talk about that in a little bit. The third diagnostic indicator of the pathology is a persecutory delusion in the child towards a normal range parent. Again, prevalence of that in the population is 0. These are all 3 impossible symptoms. And yet, these are all 3 symptoms that will be displayed in this family court pathology when there's a shared persecutory delusion and false attachment pathology. They don't show up anywhere else ever. So, how does a child acquire a persecutory delusion towards a normal range parent? It's a shared persecutory delusion. It's through the psychological control of a narcissistic, borderline, dark personality parent, leaving the imprints of their narcissistic pathology on the child. So the child shows the narcissistic traits of the parent and creating the false attachment pathology in the child for secondary gain of manipulating the court and meeting their own emotional and psychological needs. So those are the 3 diagnostic indicators of this. If those 3 symptoms are present, there is only one explanation. This should be used routinely in all cases of high conflict divorce. I don't care whether you agree with it or not as a mental health professional, just do it. Just document the symptoms, and then you can explain them any way you want. If they're present, if they're not present, whatever you want to do, just document whether these symptoms are present. It should be done routinely. Okay. Now, on the second page, I even put the DSM-5 diagnosis. So if you find these 3 symptoms, here's the diagnosis: adjustment disorder, blah, blah, blah. Child psychological abuse is the pathology. I would add to this factitious disorder imposed on another, but I think that's asking a little much of this current crop of incompetent mental health professionals. So in addition, so the diagnosis can be made on any one of those 3 diagnostic indicators. I can do that because there's no explanation for them other than the pathology. I gave the ignorant and incompetent forensic mental health people 3 of them, 3 impossible symptoms that will all be present, just to reassure them and reassure everybody that that's the pathology. It locks it in. Explain all those 3 symptoms. There is no other explanation for them. But I also gave you all 12 associated clinical signs. Now, everything else about an attachment-based model of parental alienation is established knowledge: Bowlby, Mnuchin, Beck, van der Kolk, Tronick. I applied none of my knowledge to any of the description of the pathology. And I didn't even go into intersubjective fields or those sorts of things, which would be stern and tronic. I stayed solid in Mnuchin and Bowlby and Milan, personality disorders, Linehan, in the established knowledge. The 12 associated clinical signs are entirely Dr. Childress. So I applied my knowledge and some uh, clinical experience with the pathology, and I identified 12 symptom features that will often be present, but not always present. Because they're not always present, they're not diagnostic. But because they are often present, they are associated in a cloud of symptoms. So if you've got the three diagnostic indicators and then a bunch of these associated clinical signs, that just supports the the diagnosis. These symptoms again do not show up in other pathologies, and they're specific to this type of pathology. So with the diagnostic checklist and the 12 associated clinical signs, that provides a rock solid diagnostic um, data or data for the diagnostic assessment that this is a shared persecutory delusion, or explain them using some other something, but there is no other explanation when you have that kind of pattern. Now, the question for the 12 associated clinical signs becomes how frequent is frequent? So they're often associated with the pathology, but how many of them would be indicative of support for the diagnosis? If two of them are present, if seven of them are present, how many need to be present? Well, that's an empirical decision. That's based on the research findings. I predict often. So my initial prediction was that there'd be at least four or more of these. When you have the three diagnostic indicators as present, there will be at least four or more of these associated clinical signs as well. That was just opening guess on what my standard for frequent is. And that's now been put it to the research. Ms. Greenham looked at the Dorsey's data, the CRM data, and the frequency counts for the associated clinical signs in 46 families that have the three diagnostic indicators that were in the database. So 46 families in high conflict divorce that show the three diagnostic indicators. The two questions were how many associated clinical signs do these families typically have as well? And for each of the 12 associated clinics, how prevalent are each one of them in the data surrounding these families? So let me go back again and just speak to Dorsey-Pruder's data. Um, that Dorsey in this context would be considered the lab that's generating the data. She's already done the research. Okay, so this is like when I worked at the schizophrenia project with Keith Nectarline. He put together this whole treatment clinic, the aftercare clinic that would provide treatment for schizophrenia patients. First onset, recent onset schizophrenia, they join the research project if they qualified by their symptoms, and then they'd get free care for years as we would work with them. And so they would get free clinical care, and in return, periodically, they would do these battery of testing. So, like when they're in remission, when they're in relapse, at a year point, 2 years, at various points, they would do this testing that would help us understand what's happening. And when I started the project, we had a full day of testing, 8 hours of testing that they would do at various points. By the time the project ended, we were up to 2 days of testing, 16 hours periodically. They would go through all this testing because all these researchers kept glomming on their ideas for this project because Keith Nectarline had a great population of schizophrenia. It was cleanly diagnosed by the clinic using diagnostic criteria, research diagnostic criteria. So it was a nice, clean population of recent onset schizophrenia patients. And they were tracked, stabilized on medication and stuff. So that was a really nice population. Keith Nectarline would be considered the lab that produces the data. And then all these researchers would be first authors. And then Keith Nectarline would be towards the end because he was the author or he was the lab generating the data. What Keith would do with Keith Nectarline, he would do his own articles of his own interest from his own measures that he had as part of the thing. So Dorsey Pruder is analogous to Keith Nectarline. Okay, she's already got the research project. She's already got the data. All Melanie Greenham had to do was run a research proposal through her IRB, or Institutional Review Board, and to work with Dorsey's data. Now, Dorsey's CRM data is considered what's called archival data. So it's not being actively collected from people. It's already just sitting in an archive. She's done this separately for a business venture of documenting for the court the symptoms in the family because the mental health people are refusing to document. So, you could get a mental health person just to go through and complete the diagnostic checklist. There it is, boom. But they won't. They refuse to complete the diagnostic checklist, forcing Dorsey to then create this whole research project to identify the symptoms that the mental health people refuse to identify. It is a nightmare in the family courts in terms of the quality of the mental health people over here. A nightmare. They are the worst imaginable, these forensic psychologists. So Dorsey develops the research project. And so an institutional review board, IRB, archival research is easy peasy because it's already been collected. And when she provides the frequency counts of the various data over to Melanie, Melanie's not looking at the raw data because the raw data has already been tagged by the data taggers. And so confidentiality issues are maintained within Dorsey Pruder's project within her lab, and she has authorizations to use the archival data, de-identified archival data, for research purposes. So it's easy peasy through an IRB on archival data. And so Melanie did that with her IRB, then develops a memorandum of understanding with Miss Pruder to get access to her data. So she submits her research proposal and the IRB approval to Dorsey. Dorsey looks it over, and if Dorsey agrees it's a reasonable, worthwhile research, then she signs the MOU and gives the researcher access to her data. In this case, the frequency counts for the 12 associated clinical signs for 46 families where the 3 diagnostic indicators are present. So what I want to say about that is that any other researcher anywhere on the planet can do exactly the same thing that Ms. Greenham did. You just identify what the research interests are, run it through an IRB, and get an MOU with Dorsey to get access to her data to see if your hypotheses are manifested in the data. Dorsey Pruder is producing the only data that's ever been produced in the family courts from active families in the courts. There's no research like this ever in the last 40 years for a variety of reasons, primarily because there's no operational definition for what is the pathology. There's no definition for it. Parental alienation has been what's been tried to be applied, but that's such an awful definition that it's controversial. Nobody agrees on whether those symptoms are present, absent, whatever. And so no one's ever been able to identify the population in the family courts for research purposes. There's no research grants coming in to family court pathology. You're not getting any call for, or request for proposals for from the Department of Justice to find out what's going on in the family conflict and how to solve it. There's no research over here. The closest thing, and it's not even research, it's closest thing to research, would be these retrospective kind of things by Amy Baker or something. where people look back on their childhood and see if they had parental alienation based on some vague definition. That's not research. What's going on in the families? What's the data surrounding the families? Dorsey's got data. She's got the emails, texts, everything, and she can tag it. And she did tag it for the 12 associated clinical signs and the 3 diagnostic indicators, a couple of other things. Now, before I leave Dorsey and get into the what the findings were, any researcher anywhere on the planet can retag the data. If they have some other idea other than ABPA, they can run that idea through their IRB, then go to Dorsey and say, we would like to retag the data for these categories. Now, they're going to have to bring a little money with them because they're going to hire Dorsey and they're going to hire her taggers to go back through the data they've already tagged one direction and retag for different categories. So they can look through all the emails and texts for 20 families or whatever, and whatever was decided by the research people, and then retag it according to whatever categories they think are of interest. But that takes a research grant. So they're going to have to get a research grant from somebody to do the money, but then they go over and work with Dorsey. And again, confidentiality is really sweet because Dorsey's already got the research lab. She's already sitting there with all the data in the archives, and we can tag data anyway to Sunday, or she can tag data. No, I'm not involved, but yeah, the coding data, content analysis for anything. So my question is, why aren't any university researchers contacting Ms. Kruger to get access to her data? The answer is they don't care. And that's the fundamental issue. And that goes back to why she has to do it to begin with. Why aren't they just completing the diagnostic checklist on their own and seeing whether these symptoms are present? Because they don't care. No one in forensic psychology cares about solving this. They don't want to solve it. The reason they don't want to solve it is because they're getting $20,000 to $40,000 for their child custody evaluations that solve nothing. And if they actually solve it and take a different approach, they're out of business on their $20,000 to $40,000 child custody evaluations. So it's purely financial. It's purely for the exploitation of these families over here. The clinical psychologists who actually treat the pathology and who would actually, the research of them, we left a long time ago, 40 years ago, because it's too dangerous over here. The pathology makes it too dangerous, drives all the clinical psychologists away, so that only the ignorant and incompetent remain. And that's the nature of the situation right now. The pathology has you isolated. I'm the only clinical psychologist over here, just one, just me. And all the rest are forensic. None of the other clinical psychologists will come here, and for good reason. It's a dangerous world to be for a clinical psychologist. I am establishing the path back for us. We have abandoned you. That was a wrong thing to do. We need to correct our mistake of abandoning you by making it safe for us to come back, and we need to come back. The first wave back will be the dialectic behavior therapists, and then we'll get the attachment people following soon after. So, given all that background history on where this research comes from, I got to tell you, Dorsey Kruger has lapped the university researchers, all of them, psychology, all throughout psychology, not just in the family courts, everywhere. She's lapped them. She's just put them to shame in terms of a businesswoman and a family coach has developed an excellent research project that identifies the pathology, and she did it on her own, and she did it as a businesswoman because it has market value. It has market value because the mental health people are refusing to identify the symptoms. So she had to come up with her own way of identifying the symptoms for the court. And if my view, the research methodology Dorsey uses is solid, if she identifies in the custody resolution the 3 diagnostic indicators in the symptom display, there's only one explanation for that, and that's the child psychological abuse diagnosis. So even though it's not diagnostic, the CRM diagnosis is done by mental health people. Diagnosis is a pattern match of the criteria to the symptoms. Diagnostic criteria, symptoms, do they match up in their pattern? If they do, that's your diagnosis, whether you like it or not. And so this is a pattern match that she's done of symptom criteria to or diagnostic criteria to symptom features. And if they match up, there's only one explanation. Now, shared persecutory delusion should be confirmed by clinical interview, but in my view, the courts can rely on the custody resolution method data if that's what it's showing. The but it's easy peasy to get a clinical psychologist to identify whether or not the symptoms are present, confirm them that these symptoms are actually present. Attachment systems towards a normal range parent, child rejecting a parent, 5 narcissistic personality traits displayed by the child or phobic anxiety displayed by the child towards the parent, and a shared persecutory delusion. If those 3 are present, this is a pathology. So now let's run through the associated clinical signs and the current research. So there's 12 of them I'm going to talk about. I'm going to run down each one of them. What the data says from Dorsey's CRM project, 46 families all showed the 3 diagnostic indicators. That in itself is amazing. Okay. 46 families in the family courts, the 3 diagnostic indicators that have a prevalence of 0 in the general population, all showed up in all 46 families. So that's one thing. But that's not the focus of the research. That just defined the category of the pathology. And so that shows you the research value of an attachment-based model of parental alienation and the 3 diagnostic indicators. We have a clear definition now of what the pathology is that we can now start to add additional information to look at the features of this particular type of pathology. So, of the 46 families that had the 3 diagnostic indicators, all families, all 46 had 5 or more diagnostic indicators, associated clinical signs. So, out of the 12 associated clinical signs, all of them had 5 or more. So that would be my cutoff for frequency. Would be based on empirical evidence. I would say if there's 5 or more ACS, then that provides strong support for the diagnosis when the 3 diagnostic indicators are present. Even more specifically, though, one family had 5 symptoms. All the rest, 45 of the 46 families, had 8 or more symptoms. And this article's up on ResearchGate. You can go look at it. It's table 3. So 8 or more symptoms, 8 or more ACS, 45 of 46 families. Okay, I nailed it with the ACS. They're not always present. Some are, but yeah, these are often associated clinical signs, 8 or more. So we'll run through that. And we'll run through each one of them individually, what their prevalence rate is. And that's table 2 for each one individually. So starting with ACS1, use of the word forced. And this is use of the word forced in any context by anybody. Okay? Just the word forced shows up in the data set. Why is that an associated clinical sign? For 2 reasons. One, it is a symptom feature of the transgenerational transmission of trauma, and specifically sex abuse trauma. That's the one we're worried about over here, is the transgenerational transmission of sex abuse trauma. And that is a characteristic internal working model or schema of that type of pathology, that the child was forced to do something against the child's will. You don't find that with physical abuse. You don't find that with ADHD or autism or oppositional defiant disorder anywhere. If you were to take a control group of, let's say, kids out of school system who are getting in trouble with school problems or something, getting referred to the school counselor, and you would look at all the data around these kids, you will not find the use of the word forced. You won't find teachers saying the child should be forced to do their homework or the child shouldn't be forced to come to school. No, they don't even use that word. They say the child needs to do their homework, the child needs to come to school. They don't use the word forced. That the use of that word is an indicator of sensitivity to the child being compelled to do something against their will. We compel children to do stuff against their will all the time. Get dressed, take a shower, get off the video games, go to school, do your homework. That's just forcing kids to do stuff that they don't want to do is common. It's the professional word for that is called parenting. Okay. The fact that somebody brings that up, that the child shouldn't be forced to go on visitations with the other parent, or the child shouldn't be forced to, do things, take phone calls or things. Any use of the word forced indicates a sensitivity, and that's the transgenerational trauma sensitivity. The other reason that it is an associated clinical sign and shows up is because it is highly manipulative. That's the Machiavellian level of the manipulation on ACS1. Because using the word forced implies that there's something bad that the other parent is doing. Because if that was a good parent, we wouldn't have to force the child to be with a good parent who the child loves and stuff. So by implication, just simply using the word forced implies that it's something bad. There's something bad that the other parent's doing. No, they're not. We're not forcing the child to be with that parent. We are giving the child the opportunity to bond to both parents. That's the authentic framing of things. And so that use of the word forced is a manipulative way to get people to back off. Oh, we don't want to force a child to be with that parent. And then they back off. Well, is there something bad with that parent? And what's going on? And it gets us backed off of treatment that says the treatment you need to go be with your parent because that's what the court order says. That's what treatment says, or no problem. But no, wait, you don't want to force the child to do that. We want the child to cooperate. So it's a highly manipulative use of that term. And so that's where that shows up. And in the CRM data, the prevalence of ACS1 is 85%. 85%, the ACS1 shows up in 85% of the families. Now, ACS1 and 2 also go together. That's why I put ACS1 first, because it's a useful tell on the pathology. When you're reading a document and a declaration by the allied parent, and the parent uses that phrase, the child shouldn't be forced to go on visitations with, or that we shouldn't force the child, click. That should be a trigger to kind of pay attention. It's not diagnostic, but it's something to listen for. And so I put that as number one, and I use number 2 because these two go together. Number 2 is empowering the child to reject the other parent. So the sentences you will hear put together are: the child shouldn't be forced to go with the other parent. The child should be allowed to decide on visitations. So you see how they kind of go together. One is it takes away our ability to um, compel the child and to take leadership of the child. It puts the child in charge. We shouldn't force the child, implies there's something bad going on, and then empowers the child to reject the other parent. What happens there is the pathological narcissistic borderline dark parent first psychologically controls the child, gets the child in this enmeshed cross-generational coalition. And once they have manipulated the child onto their side in the spousal conflict, then that's the force. We shouldn't force the child. The child's over on our side now. That then they empower the child's voice to reject the other parent, and they just hide behind the child and say, "It's not me. It's the child who is rejecting. What can I do? I can't force the child to take phone calls from the other parent. The child should be allowed to decide, how much contact they have with that other parent." And so that's your constellation of 1 and 2. ACS2 was present in 100% of the families. 100%. Okay, so it's kind of a little bit diagnostic. If you have a parent who is empowering the child to reject the other parent, you got this pathology. Now, is it possible that the targeted parent is abusive? And that's why the use of the word forced is there. We shouldn't force a child to be with an authentically abusive parent. Or, we empower the child to sever the bond to an abusive parent. Is that possible? Yes, absolutely. Okay, so if that's an authentically abusive parent, if the targeted parent is abusing the child, let's diagnose it and put it on a treatment plan and fix it. Okay, that's the differential diagnosis. Going back to the beginning, is attachment pathology. It's either child abuse by the targeted parent or it's psychological abuse by the allied parent. So let's rule out child abuse by the targeted parent. You do that by the parenting practices rating scale. You identify what their parenting is. If it's level 1 or 2, that becomes the focus. If it's levels 3 and 4, then let's do the diagnostic checklist and let's start looking at the associated clinical signs because that's a normal range parent. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't force the child to be with a healthy parent. It's not forcing, it's giving the child an opportunity to be loved by each parent, by both parents. That's a good thing. So that's ACS 1 and 2. That's why I put them 1 and 2, because they are very characteristic of this pathology, and it's a nice tell. The other nice tell on the use of the word forced is from mental health professionals. If you hear a mental health professional use the word forced, wait a minute, they've got that sensitivity in them. That's the countertransference issue. So it exposes countertransference in the mental health people, that they are susceptible to believing the shared delusion based on their own childhood history. Then I had a choice. What do I put for ACS 3? And I chose for 3 and 4, I chose 2 symptoms, associated symptoms that are diagnostic. They're not always present, but when they are present, there's only one thing that causes them, the ACS 3 and ACS 4. So if these symptoms are present, we got the pathology. I can guarantee you we'll see the 3 diagnostic indicators and a bunch of associated clinical signs. So number 3 is exclusion demand. That's where the child says, I don't want my parent to attend my soccer games, my graduation ceremony, my music recital, my activities. And what this is and where this comes from is the child is a regulatory object for the allied parent. And so the pathological parent, narcissistic borderline parent. So now if they're at, let's say, a music recital, the child's going to be playing their music, and the targeted parent shows up to listen, that stresses the allied parent. The allied parent now starts to go, yeah, and now the child as a regulatory object has to regulate that parent. And so now their focus goes off to the dark attitudes, and they're worried about what's going to happen here. But they're not focusing on what they're doing. They're not focusing on their basketball game or their, school awards ceremony or something. They're worried about their parents, and specifically the pathological parents who's becoming dysregulated. So that's where you get the child saying, I can't concentrate, when the targeted parent's there. Yeah, but it's not the targeted parent being there. It's the other one who gets dysregulated. All children love attention. All children love their friends and family and grandparents and just everybody coming to their events, their soccer game, and watching them play. All kids love that. So to get a kid saying, I don't want you at my event is not normal. That is not in any way near anything that happens. ADHD, autism, oppositional defiant disorder, juvenile justice. I don't care. You don't never see that with an authentic child. The other feature of this is that the pathological parent doesn't want the other parent there. They want to hurt them. You're no longer part of your child's life. I'm going to hurt you. It's a spousal abuse thing. And so they have control over the child, and they manipulate the child and their stress and stuff to get the child, again, role reversal, the child to reject the other parent, and they empower that rejection. So the child is serving as a regulatory object for the narcissistic borderline dark parent. So that's ACS3, almost 100% diagnosis. I would say it is 100%. It's just not always present. The prevalence for ACS3 is 63%. So about half the families, a little over half the families, show ACS3. ACS4 is parental replacement. Again, that is never zero prevalence rate, because the attachment system is a very specific motivational system. If it motivates the child to run to any adult in the social group, that child might not get protection from the predator, from any adult. The child gets protection from the predator from a specific adult, my mother, my father. So that quality of possessiveness to that parent-child relationship, that is my mom, that is my dad, is extraordinarily strong. It never spontaneously messes up. Occasionally, if you have no dad in the family for 10 years, a child's been adopted by another, by their stepdad, and the child will say, my stepdad's my dad, because they were the one was there for me, raising me, and they're in that role of my dad. You'll see that sometimes, but not if there's a parent, an authentic biological parent available. You don't see a child saying, that's not my mom or dad. And so a child referring to their mother or father by the first name, Bob or Mary or something, that's an ACS4. And or the child referring to the new step parent of the narcissistic borderline dark personality parent as mom or dad. That's a replacement stuff. And so either one of those, calling the parent first name or calling the step parent mom or dad, is ACS4, and it's almost 100% diagnostic of this pathology. Now, it is possible that you can find families with 2 or 3 of these symptoms present that don't have the pathology. I'd be questionable about that. I don't see the research yet on that, but it will come eventually as to how prevalent these may be in the general population. I suspect they are very low. But even if you get 2 or 3 or even 4 of these ACS, if it's not a shared delusional disorder, then you won't get the 3 diagnostic indicators. And the support from the ACS is when you get up to around 8 or 9 of these. Then if you got 8 or 9 ACS, then this is what you're looking at. This is the pathology that predicts that you will have a lot of these symptoms. It's kind of like the MMPI and the way that's kind of run. It's empirically based. So everybody will get some answers within the depression category and some answers within the mania category, but it's a high frequency that shows up. The pathology shows up as a high frequency of those symptoms. So ACS4, that shows up in about 54% of the families. So ACS3 and 4, while very indicative of the pathology, only shows up in about half of them, at least in the data that we have. The data would be much improved if it was actually conducted by clinical interviews rather than documented data. It's hard to document stuff in data. To see symptoms. It's a lot easier if you have a clinical interview that's looking for, is this symptom present or absent? The problem is the forensic mental health people are refusing to identify the symptoms, whether they're present or absent. So in the absence of the refusal, Dorsey said, okay, and developed this whole research methodology to provide the court with the information that the mental health people are refusing to provide the court with. So ACS5. So that's the unforgivable event. So I went through in ordering these, and I'll wrap up here in a little bit, and I'll continue on later with the others. But ACS5 is the unforgivable event. Started with the 2, forced. We shouldn't force the child, and Child should be allowed to decide. Then I put in the two that were diagnostic but not always present. And then what's the next most important ACS? That, in my mind, was ACS 5, which is the unforgivable event. That the child will use some event from the past as the justification for all current and future rejection. The implication is that it's somehow PTSD, that the child is still traumatized by this past event and can't get over it. Well, first off, a PTSD diagnosis, criteria A, is going to require exposure to threatened or actual death, serious injury, or sexual violence. If there's no exposure to death, serious injury, or sexual violence, there is no trauma that can produce PTSD. PTSD is a particular type of brain state that goes into and then can't undo the brain state. And the brain state is created by threatened exposure or actual exposure to death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Some conflict in the family that does not involve that cannot produce PTSD symptoms. Okay, that's number one. Second, conflict is caused by a cue in the environment, stimulus response. So then the question is, what is the current cue that is triggering the current conflict? And you're saying it's some event that occurred 6 months ago? No, that event was 6 months ago. What is the current cue in this room that is triggering that event? What it actually is, what ACS 5 actually is the child is misattributing a grief response. They are sad because of the breakup of the family. They're sad because they lost a relationship with the targeted parent. That's a tremendous grief response. So they're feeling authentically sad. They just don't know why. They think it's because the targeted parent is doing something bad under the influence of the meaning constructions of the allied parent. They're doing something bad to you. But the child has to generate reasons for the way they feel. And it's a oh, well, you did something in the past, and so now I can't forgive you. The allied parent accepts that as a reason. They say, oh, that's perfectly understandable reason. You were traumatized and you don't want to be with them again, so we're going to go with that reason. The child says, well, that's an acceptable reason. That's the reason I'm going to give for my rejection, but it's not an authentic reason. And if you probe it, well, what's going on now? How do we fix it now? There's nothing we can do to fix it. It's this way forever. That's the splitting. That's very characteristic of splitting. Things once defined do not change. That's Marshall Linehan's quote on splitting. So this symptom feature, number 5, the unforgivable event, is a symptom feature of splitting pathology in the family, and it has to do with the misattribution of grief relative to the situation. So so there's no cue in the current situation. There's no stimulus control. The current parent doesn't have stimulus control of the child's behavior. Number 6 is an interesting one. The use of the word liar or fake. Now, this is by the child. The child will say that the targeted parent, when they say, oh, they're loving, I love you and I want to be with you, the child will say they're a liar or they're being fake, that they are they're different with other people than they are in private. That's what the child will say. Now, again, that's a transgenerational transmission of trauma. You can hear that that would be the description the allied parent would give of their own childhood abuse, that their parent was different in private than they were in public. That's classic sex abuse kind of situation. Nobody sees, that's a deception on this. So here we have a pattern coming off of child sex abuse into this situation. No child says, when the parent says, I love you, no normal child in any other context situation says, no, you don't. You're a liar. You're fake. Never happens. Not in ADHD, not in autism, not in oppositional defiant, not in juvenile justice, not anywhere else. Here it happens. The child says you're fake. And it produces a very unique symptom feature for this pathology, in that the child's attachment system wants to bond to the targeted parent. That's a beloved parent. And so the child wants to bond to that parent, but can't because of the loyalty conflicts and the sides and the whole conflict they're in. So now they have a breached relationship with that parent. Their grief goes off the charts because of the breached relationship, but the child doesn't know why it hurts. They just know something about this parent hurts. And then the other parent saying it's because they're a bad parent. The child goes, well, it must be because when I'm with them, it hurts more. When I'm away from them, I'm not motivated to bond, so it hurts less. And so there's something about that that's hurting more. Now, that creates, that misattribution creates a very unique feature, which is when we improve the quality of the targeted parent, we offer more love, more affection, just more understanding to the child. Now, in normal situations, when we make the parent better, more loving, more affectionate, more available, the child's symptoms go away, go down. In this case, when we do that, the child's symptoms get worse. When the parent says, I love you, the child becomes enraged. What? Because it hurts more. The more wonderful this parent is, the more the child wants to bond to them, but they're not. So their grief response gets worse. And so it's a unique feature of this that when the parent says, I love you and I care, the child has to deny the authenticity of that. No, they don't love me. No, it's they're lying to me. It's fake. They're being fake. How devastating is that for a child to believe that their mother or father doesn't love them? When they do, there's lots of love, but the child has this fixed and false belief that that parent doesn't love them. Oh my goodness, we have to fix that right away. But if we try to fix it, the child denies and says, no, it's fake. They're a liar. So I'm going to wrap up here for this Sunday. I'll continue on with the ACS 7 down to 12 in the future talk. Um, the uh, One of the things I want to point out, though, pat myself on the back here, an attachment-based model of parental alienation predicts, these are predictions here, and the predictions have been confirmed. So the model that made these predictions is absolutely true and accurate. So ABPA is a 100% true and accurate description of the pathology, made predictions, predictions were confirmed. That the ACS, with those ACS, I am predicting specific word choices: forced, liar, fake. You will hear those specific words in addition to little sentences like the child should be allowed to decide on visitation. We need to listen to the child, or advocating for the child's testimony to the court, empowering the child. So these are very specific predictions. ADHD doesn't predict the child will use a word. It's just broad behavior. Autism doesn't say the child's going to use these. I'm predicting word choices. There is zero way I can predict and find word choices if the model that was predicting them wasn't accurate. And so it is. It is 100% accurate with the pathology. So so let's see, just for ACS 5, as I wrap up here, when the ACS 5, the unforgivable event showed up in 96% of the families. 96% of the families, the child's reason for the rejection was some unforgivable event in the past rather than any sort of current issues. And ACS 6, the liar or fake, the use of that word, 87% of families showed the child using that word, liar or fake. 87%. Again, you won't find the prevalence of that in the liar or fake in ADHD is zero. Prevalence of a child calling a parent liar or fake in juvenile justice, zero. But here we get an 87% frequency for um, ACS 6. So I got to tell you, this research from Greenham, Childress, and Kruder is substantial. It verifies the truth of the model that made these predictions. And ABPA is 100% a true and accurate description of the pathology and three diagnostic indicators and 12 association clinical signs, the diagnostic checklist for pathogenic parenting, should be collected 100% of the time with all families in family court conflict around child custody. Um, let me just as I leave, let me run through the rest of the prevalence rates here. So for ACS7, which is the various themes for rejection. One of those themes identified was in all 46 families, so the prevalence of that was 100%. ACS8, which is the unwarranted use of the word abuse, that has to do with borderline personality pathology. That is at 89% prevalence rate in 46 families. ACS9, excessive phone calls and texting. This was the low one. This was at 30% of families showed excessive texting. I'm not sure why. I suspect it might be simply that it doesn't show up in the documented data, but if this was done by clinical interviews, the prevalence rate would rise. And then various hypotheses is about why this one might show a little bit lower than the rest of them. Be interesting to find out. There's different subgroups within the pathology. So ACS 10 is the role reversal use of the child. It's not me, it's the child who wants to go to this school. It's not me, it's the child who wants to take music lessons. It's not me, it's the child who, and so the parent gets their needs met by putting whatever the parent desires in the mouth of the child. That's a role reversal relationship of the child. And that is in 96% of the families. Almost 100% of the families show that it's not me, it's the child who's doing all these things, role reversal use of the child. What should be happening is a parent, adults take responsibility for what school the child goes to, what extracurricular activity. These are adult decisions. These are not, the decisions you give to the child and put the child in the middle of all the conflict. ACS 11, the targeted parent deserves to be rejected. This is your spousal abuse theme. Yeah, of course I hit her. She deserved it. My dinner was cold. So that's a spousal abuse symptom here. 100% of the families that the targeted parent deserves to be rejected. That's the cruelty. No, we're not nice to other people because of who they are. We're nice because of who we are, is the actual value system. The narcissistic value system is it's okay to be cruel to people if they deserve it, and then they decide who deserves their cruelty. So that the 100% prevalence of ACS 11 would be strongly indicative that this is a spousal abuse pathology, using the child as a weapon, and then in weaponizing the child, they create such significant pathology that it becomes child psychological abuse. But fundamentally, at its core, this is a spousal abuse pathology. And then ACS 12, that the allied parent or child disregards court orders for child custody. And a little variance whether it's the adult or child that's doing it. But if the child is defying court orders, that speaks to the parenting that they're getting from the allied parent. And so I would actually put a child neglect diagnosis on the table. If I have a child who is defying court orders for something, then I'm going to put child neglect the allied parent on the table for possible diagnosis. If you can't get your child to school, medical appointments, or get them to follow court orders, then we need to relook at your parenting. And go over to juvenile justice. If you got kids, defying court orders and stuff, that's a failure in parenting. That's happening in those families. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my coffee for this week. Good luck to everybody, and we'll see if this actually came out onto my website. Bye bye.